Section 3. The Petty Imperia. With the collapse of the Astronomicon and the fall of Terra, the Imperium, as previously noted, was shattered utterly. From Millennium 43 onwards, even the concept of a united human empire became nearly impossible as local powers and selfish megalomaniacs took their opportunities to strike. No longer was there an Imperium. That monolithic concept had died in the fires of anarchy. From now on, there were merely hundreds of petty imperia and kingdoms. Some were the size of sectors, others merely consisting of a single world or system. Some of these imperia claimed authority from Terra and tried to unify. Others abandoned the Imperium, declaring themselves avatars for him or even trying to supplant him entirely. Some maintained the xenophobic stance of the old Imperium, while others grew lax or simply ignored the teachings of the Church. Some, such as Ophelia, took their fervor too far. We must also remember that many imperial worlds simply collapsed as warp storms cut them off from essential supplies. This was particularly a problem for many hive worlds, who simply starved to death within a couple of years as their agri-worlds were severed due to warp storms or mad warlords stealing the supplies before they got there. It would take years to explain every Imperium created at this time and every situation that they entailed. However, I shall endeavor to depict the largest and most influential petty imperia created, along with the monikers created to differentiate between them. In reality, each of the petty imperia merely called themselves the Imperium, as they refused to admit the legitimacy of their rivals. 1. The Rogue Trader Imperium. The most eastern of the petty imperia, the Imperium of Gerhed-Lusser, is possibly the most changed. During the first decades of chaos following the Astronomicon's collapse, the extremely successful rogue trader Lusser was forced to break warp in the system of Corin, along with his large, well-stocked, and well-armed trading fleet. Lusser was a shrewd man, and the death of all his astropaths told him the Imperium was no more. He wasted no time with incredulity or shock, and instead set to work. He knew that, in order to protect his assets in the wake of the collapse, he needed to form a base of operations and acquire territory and property. Corin would have to do. He made planetfall on Corin II, a populous hive world and capital of the system, discussed various protection deals for the planet, entering negotiations with the Lord Governor's staff and government. His scribes and law scholars, using complex litigation and jargon, managed to swindle Lusser into the governmental process, insinuating him into the essential position of defense and culture chamberlain. Over the years, this role branched into other areas, like weapons manufacture and internal security. Though he wisely kept the Adeptus Arbites on as enforcers, their role expanded to overall system security rather than just enforcing of imperial law. Using his acquired wealth and vast resources, he bought the southern Hivespire for himself and built a lavish apartment complex with extensive grounds. His ambitions went further, however. When elections for the next governor came around 2 decades later, Lusser was there, patronizing a promising candidate for the role. The eventual governor picked was his man, and this gave him unprecedented power in the system. He integrated his fleet with the large fleets of monitors and system defense ships before using them to secure other worlds in the system, such as the prison moon orbiting Corin 5. Crucially, Lusser recognized the need for an effective fighting force beyond the PDF in order for him to secure territories beyond the Corin system. Corin was a roughly average system, except for a vast Adeptus Mechanicus storage facility located on the western continent of Cotton II. Through corrupted local laws, he used his powers to order the storage yards searched. What he found would alter the course of the rogue trader Imperium's history. Thousands upon thousands of Corvus-patterned suits of Space Marine power armor. He threatened to have the remaining tech priests upon the world destroyed unless they adapted these suits for human soldiery. They, realizing they were cut off from the rest of their brethren, accepted these terms. Pragmatically, Lusser realized he couldn't make perfect human-sized power armor from these suits. So, he had them combined with elements of carapace armor in order to mass-produce them quicker. However, he still needed bodies to fill them, not wanting to deplete the PDF or the reserves, and refusing to relinquish his own personal army for this task. He turned to the dregs of Corin, the local underhivers and the convicts imprisoned upon Corn Five's cold moon. He persuaded many thousands to volunteer, offering pardons, free food, and the prospect of drugs and violence to these hard-bitten killers in exchange for service. These brutes were trained by the very best soldiers of Corin, and even the one Astartes upon Lusser's staff, Sergeant Proker of the White Scars. They were equipped with the cheapest, oldest bolters Lusser could scrounge up, as they were the only ones available. Even then, there weren't enough, so many of the armored shock troops had to make do with heavy caliber autoguns. Worried about loyalty, Lusser devised a cunning strategy. He gave the soldiers combat-enhancing drugs and stimulants, making them stronger and faster, though the drugs had the added benefit of being addictive. These shock troops became dependent upon them, which ensured their constant loyalty. Lusser, ever the rogue, presumptuously called them Space Marines. But within a few hundred years, the Corn System's Imperium faced a major problem. Their reserves of food were running dangerously low after so many years cut off from trade with the local agri-world. Fortunately, the warp storms had somewhat cleared, and Lusser grabbed this opportunity with both hands. He ordered his fleets to the agri-world as swiftly as possible. Led by Loker, he then dispatched his space marines as well. Using a series of short warp jumps, the fleet took a couple of months to reach the agri-world, which would have taken only a week to travel before the collapse of the Emperor's guiding light. Initially, the world refused to submit to the Imperium, and so Loker led his marines into battle. The sacking of the world took only a couple of weeks. The borderline psychotic and lethally efficient Space Marines utterly bested the sparse and inexperienced PDF defenders. The planet was subdued, and trade resumed with Corin within the year. This was to be the first action amongst many that the Space Marines of Corin would undertake. Over the next few decades, the petty Imperium swelled to over 25 worlds. With this, the size of the Space Marine force expanded along with the auxiliary, non-power armored army that soon sprang up in their wake, which was used to garrison captured worlds. This empire under Lusser was a profoundly poor one, but was nevertheless ingenious. Any scraps of technology, no matter how bizarre and incomplete, were used by Lusser's captured adepts, and made into things that could almost be called useful. Remote-controlled bombs, converted land speeder chassis, poor-quality programmable robots, and various other bizarre pieces of technology. Everything found a use. He was also open in his recruitment, allowing mutants and scum into his imperial army, each with their own regiments. Thus, a rogue became a ruler and rebuilt his own little imperium into something resembling civilization. 2. The Ophelian Imperium. In those dark, chaotic early days of the Cataclysm, when the Emperor finally died, it seemed as though the center of the Imperial Church was ripped out forever and stamped into dust. However, the Ecclesiarch managed to flee Terra even as demons began to pour from the Imperial Palace like a vile fanged tide. Though the majority of his fleet were either destroyed in the escape or dragged into insanity during the turbulent warp transit, the head of the Ministorum survived and descended upon Ophelia, the second most holy site in the whole Imperium. War and anarchy tore across the Imperium, and he quickly realized the Imperium needed a rallying point. Thus, the Ecclesiarch Pius Gaia gathered together all the astropaths that had not been consumed by the sudden loss of their anchor point in the warp, and ordered them to send out a message. A summons to the Adepta Sororitas, ordering all of them, no matter where they were, to return to their spiritual center. Over the next decade, the orders made their way back to Ophelia, fighting through the consuming madness and chaos to get back to their home. Over half of the Sisters of Battle, the militant orders, had died in the terrible wars against the new Devourer, and less than half of these survivors made it back to Ophelia. Most either died in transit, got stranded on isolated worlds, or were otherwise slain by the ravenous monsters that crawled from the depths of madness, the fall of the Imperium emboldening these terrors enough to act. Yet, still the sisters came, and Ophelia was secured. Xenos and demonic forces were driven from the surrounding worlds within short transit to Ophelia, and an imperium of roughly 30 worlds was brought under the direct rule of the Ministorum in exile. Pius soon declared that his imperium was the one true imperium, and only his imperium truly followed the dictates of the emperor. He refused to acknowledge the emperor's death, and merely reformed his imperium's laws, making them fulfill the rules of the church much more closely. His imperium became a theocracy far more strict and powerful than any imperium before it. Broken naval fleets who survived their warp transits flocked to this new imperium, and with them came a reasonable amount of imperial guardsmen who were quick to convert to the Ophelian imperium's new pious doctrines. Pathetically grateful to their saviors, the humans upon these worlds swiftly reconverted to the imperial church. Fanatics clogged the streets of every world. Flagellants, doomsayers, and receptionists filled the air with fevered sounds of desperate prayers to their dead god. Ophelia itself, the vast world-spanning cathedral, was flooded with gibbering and despairing pilgrims and desperate civilians. They all demanded to understand why their god had forsaken them. How could the Emperor lose? Was not humanity the dominant force in the universe? Many ascensionist cults arose on the Ophelian worlds. They held the view that the Emperor had not died, but instead ascended to full godhood. The fall of the Imperium was his divine judgment upon man. Pious Gaia, who had been steadily growing more and more unhinged, latched upon this idea. Canonus Superior Kyrillicus, one of the ecclesiarch's new ruling body, the Council of Three, recommended caution. Unfortunately, the final member of the Council of Three was Inquisitor Lord Karamazov, the infamous Pyrophant of Salem Proctor. He agreed with the Ascensionists and the Ecclesiarch, and so new reforms were passed. The official view now was that the Emperor had ascended, and he was punishing the decadent Imperium. The only way to save their souls now, Karamazov declared, was sacrifice and the punishment of the obvious heretics within their society. Mankind was lax and monstrous, and he had the cure: fire. Across the Imperium, Pius's sisters and Karamazov's baying mobs of recently converted fraterist militia invaded their own worlds, denouncing millions as heretics before either beating them to death with rods and flails or dragging them away on the witch ships of the Ophelian Imperium. Night and day, Ophelia glowed with a baleful orange light playing across the towering domes and noble Baroque spires of the Holy World from near constantly burning furnaces beneath the giant cathedral. Thousands of heretics were shipped in, only to be herded into the cleansing flames one by one. Priests stood on great lecterns on either side of the horrific furnaces, babbling insane rhetoric from the various holy books that Ophelia had hoarded over the millennia. Karamazov personally executed 1,000 heretics, his throne of judgment in near constant use. The people of Ophelia, however, did not resist these insane zealots. In fact, many of the most insane ascensionists threw themselves into the fires, crying hymns as their bodies blistered and burned to ash. For 20 years, this reign of murderous terror continued. It was said that the process only stopped when a young girl, barely 6 Terran years old, ran to the ecclesiarch, evading guards, and kissed his feet in religious adoration. Before he could respond, the girl was shot by a wild-eyed fraterist militiaman. In a terrible rage, Pius ordered the man's innards boiled, and he was taken away to be executed. The genocide stopped soon after, as Pius realized his orders had destroyed even the faithful. He had come to this realization despairingly late, and the Ophelian Imperium was left severely weakened following this period of witch hunts. Almost a third of the population was killed, and the Imperium's industry was terribly understaffed. After another 20 years, the Imperium was still struggling, and it took the Talaran War to open the new ecclesiarch, Honestorians' eyes to this conspicuous lack of resources. It was in 234, Millennium 45, that the Ophelian Imperium first came into conflict with the Talaran Empire. The Talarans were located just to the galactic east of the Ophelians. The Talarans had been a tiny empire under the rule of the original Imperium, and their greatest contribution to it had been merely desert specialist Imperial Guard regiments. With the loss of the Imperium, Talaran had survived surprisingly well, having already a small empire with its own resources. The lack of an imperial tithe for soldiers had allowed them to expand their PDF force far beyond what was once allowed. In fact, so much did it expand that they inevitably developed an active offensive force and managed to maintain a fleet of starships, using captured AdMech expertise and an abundance of natural resources on one of their periphery colonies, which soon became one giant shipyard. The Talaran believed strongly in the Emperor, but their views were far more traditionalist than Ophelia's radical reforms. Thus, when Talaran expanded westwards and encountered Ophelian worlds, they offered these worlds an alternative to Ophelian insanity. Many civilians of these outlying worlds, disgruntled with the massive death toll of the Ophelian regime, openly pleaded to the Talaran to save them, or so the Talaran Empire claimed. Thus, when the Sororitas came to put down these revolts, the Talaran fleets were there to engage them, and so the war began. The Talaran vessels were of poor quality, and most of their conscript armies were nowhere near as effective as the highly disciplined Adepta Sororitas. However, the Sororitas had incredibly weak supply lines, and their resources were woefully depleted. It was said at the Battle of Kanine the sisters fought without bolters, for the supply of shells was so low. In contrast, the Talarans had a well-developed and above all, extensive logistic train, with numerous way stations supplying their vessels between each short warp jump. Their ships were cheap and terrible, but numerous, and they overwhelmed the Sisters of Battle. The Ophelians lost 16 worlds in the war and were driven back from their former territory, all because of depleted resources. Subsequently, Honestorian instigated his heathen levy reforms. These new ecclesiarchal bulls tasked the large witch ship fleets to change their tactics. They were to spread out from Ophelian space and find heathen worlds. The populations of these worlds, due to their heresies, were to be subjugated. However, they would not be offered conversion as a way out. Instead, all non-Ophelian imperial cultists, be they Thorians, Haemovores, machine cultists, or anyone else, were to be set to work as slaves and serfs. They would work the fields of the surviving Ophelian agri-worlds, and they were put to work in the industrial worlds that the Ecclesiarch permitted to be built on worlds within the Empire. The Emperor, Honestorian was quoted as saying, desires the Imperium be rebuilt in his divine image. He destroyed the old realm, so shall we rebuild it to his exaltations. Our penance has been paid now in blood and ash. Now the time of reformation is at hand. Thus began the second phase of the Ophelian Imperium. In many ways, this phase of the Ophelian Imperium was even more terrible than the initial phase. However, that is a story for a later date. 3. The Delphane Imperium. Lord Inquisitor Delphane was a very powerful inquisitor, leading a vast conglomeration of imperial forces in the cleansing of the Carpathus system when the Astronomicon finally collapsed. Many thousands of his fleet's vessels were lost in the warp, and the rest were spat out somewhere within the Ultima Segmentum. Delphane's astropaths and navigators all died, save for one named Orichi. Using her talents, Delphane discovered several nearby systems, and he persuaded the fleet admiral to make a series of short warp jumps to reach these nearby worlds. Within 6 months, they made it to these systems. The Inquisitor dispensed with pleasantries and instantly seized the governor's palace of the capital world, Harkin. When he discovered that Harkin and its fellow in-system worlds had all suffered losses of astropaths and witnessed widespread riots in the streets, he knew something very wrong had happened. This realization became more and more evident as Millennium 43 continued onwards. For 13 years, the Inquisitor and his crusade forces desperately fought off constant pirate attacks and Xenos incursions that seemed to be a near constant occurrence across the entire subsector. As they fought, they unconsciously began to utilize Harkin and its systems more and more. Reserves for Lost Guardsmen came from within Harkinian PDF ranks. Munitions and supplies were gifted by the governors and provincial lords of Harkin and the outlying worlds in adjacent systems. The Harkin system was always in an unofficial league of governors, even before the death of the Emperor. Where before, the Inquisitor would have probably destroyed the League due to the potential for subversive behavior inherent to their League, he now openly encouraged it. The close ties between the worlds was utilized to its fullest by the cunning Inquisitor. Using his crusade force of Red Hunters Marines, Death Watch, and vast regiments of inquisitorial stormtroopers and Imperial Guardsmen, Delphine kept the League of Planetary Governors, or LPG, relatively intact. However, it became clear that there was no one else coming to relieve the Inquisitor and his forces. The Emperor was dead, and so was his Imperium. Yet, this was not a particularly terrible problem for the pragmatic Delphine. Over years of fighting, the infrastructure of his crusade and that of the governments of the LPG had merged significantly. His crusade was divided, fighting on all fronts across the LPG's borders, and many of his generals had agreed to defense contracts with local power magnates and lords, offering protection in exchange for supplies and limited leadership of the aforementioned provinces. Delphine himself became famous, and many called him the Breaker, due to a legendary battle on the borders where the Inquisitor used his thunderhammer to smash the gates of a rebellious city open, allowing his troops to enter the city and slaughter the enemy. When the old governor of Harkin died, it was with popular support that Delphine, flanked by his Red Hunter Astartes bodyguards, entered the central city and seized the leadership officially. Though the LPG technically was a council of equals, the Harkin seat was always the most powerful. With Delphine on the throne, it became clear that this was no longer a mere alliance, but an empire. Delphine, intoxicated by his success in crafting a functioning state from the ashes of a shattered Imperium, declared that this was the new Imperium, the sole legitimate power in the universe. And, in a bold move, he declared himself Holy King, chosen of the Emperor. While the more primitive worlds of his 50-world Imperium could readily accept this, the more urban hive worlds and agri-worlds became uneasy. During this period, there were hundreds of rebellions. Each was easily crushed by the feudal military of Delphine. The largest of these rebellions was led by Aurici, who was declared Oracle of the Future and denounced Delphine as apostate and anti-emperor. Crucially, she gained the support of a number of lords on the outskirts who rallied around her. A large naval engagement over the world of Fancit decided this rebellion, and Aurici was killed during the battle. Unified once more, the Delphine Imperium seemed to set to maintain itself as a seated power. However, in 444, Millennium 45, the now ancient Delphine finally died. The vassal governors each claimed they should take his place, while the Red Hunters backed Delphine's son, Abar Delphine, as next in line. Unwilling to challenge the dread Astartes, the governors acceded without incident. Abar was young and impetuous, deluded by the distorted tales of the past Imperium told to him by his father. Abar declared that they must expand into the galaxy and re-establish the Imperium. However, he did not take into account the fact that most worlds were still recovering from almost a century of civil war. The belligerent young king ordered expeditions into neighboring systems, but these occupations could never work, as he hadn't the resources for such actions. In the end, these turned into raids and wars of plunder, where greedy former Crusade generals, power magnates, and local lords, who increasingly became indistinguishable from each other, so similar in power and prestige the three strata were, would make planetfall on various human and Xenos worlds, smash their cities, and slaughter hundreds of thousands of people at random, rape women and men, burn down the perceived heathen churches, and steal all things considered valuable. Abar Delphine allowed this practice as it provided a ready stream of income into his Imperium. However, it soon drew the attention of other powerful forces who soon descended upon this Imperium. This Imperium, which considered itself so very mighty, would soon be proven entirely wrong.